If your water suddenly tastes like metal, you don't ask questions. You start counting who did it. That was the first thought that hit me the second the faucet clicked open and the sink filled with that faint, cloudy swirl. I didn't even need to take a full sip. The smell told me everything. Chlorine. But not the clean kind. This was heavier, bitter, like something trying to hide behind it. I stood there in my own kitchen, hands still on the tap, listening to the low hum of the pipes behind the walls, and for a second, everything felt wrong. The air, the silence, even the light coming through the window felt off, like the whole place knew something I didn't. My name is Ethan Walker, and I've spent the last 12 years working as an environmental systems engineer, specializing in water treatment and distribution across Central Texas. I've designed filtration systems for towns smaller than this one, traced contamination sources through miles of underground pipe, and I can tell you exactly what clean water should smell like. This wasn't it. Not even close. I shut off the faucet slowly, wiped my hand on my jeans, and stared at the sink like it had just lied to me. Because it had. 48 hours earlier, everything had been normal. Better than normal. The lake behind my house, my lake, had been glass calm under the morning sun. The kind of still water that reflects the sky so perfectly it feels like you're standing between two worlds. I grew up on that shoreline. Learned to fish there with my dad before I was tall enough to cast without tangling the line. That lake wasn't just water. It was history. It was memory. It was the reason I came back here instead of taking a six-figure job in Houston. And then, 2 mornings ago, I walked down to the dock and stopped dead halfway across the grass. The smell hit first. Sharp. Chemical. Not strong enough to knock you back, but wrong enough to make your stomach tighten. The surface of the water looked off. Not rippling, not moving right. There was a sheen across it, thin but visible if you knew what you were looking for. And the fish, dozens of them, floating near the edge, still pale, drifting like something had flipped a switch overnight. I remember crouching down at the waterline, the damp wood of the dock pressing into my palm, staring at it like my brain was trying to reject what my eyes were seeing. Lakes don't just change like that. Not without a reason. Not without help. And that's when I knew this wasn't natural. It wasn't runoff. It wasn't algae. It was deliberate. I straightened up slowly, scanning the tree line, the neighboring properties, the distant rooftops of the subdivision that had crept closer every year. Willow Creek Estates, clean lawns, matching mailboxes, HOA letters printed on heavy paper that smelled faintly of perfume and control. I could already hear her voice in my head before I even turned back toward the house. Linda Crawford, HOA president, mid-50s, perfect posture, perfect smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. She'd been after that lake for months. Said it was a liability. Said it attracted the wrong kind of activity. Translation: people she couldn't control. Fishing especially drove her crazy. Too many trucks. Too much noise. Too many people who didn't belong to her version of the neighborhood. I'd ignored her at first. Then I pushed back. Politely. Legally. Every time she tried to slide another restriction into the HOA guidelines, I sent it back with documentation. Property lines. Water rights. County codes. She smiled through all of it. That same tight smile. Like she was just waiting for something. Standing there in my kitchen now, staring at that sink, I felt that same tightness in my chest. Because whatever she'd been waiting for, it had already happened. I walked over to the window and looked out toward the line of trees that hid the lake from view. Somewhere beyond them, that water sat still and poisoned. And somehow, it had made its way here. Into my house. Into the pipes. Into the system. The low hum in the walls grew louder the longer I listened, like the whole place was breathing through it. That's when the realization hit me, slow and heavy, settling into place piece by piece like a puzzle I didn't want to finish. I knew this system. I'd reviewed the infrastructure plans when I moved back. I knew where the intake valves were. I knew where the treatment station sat. And more importantly, I knew exactly where this neighborhood got its water. I didn't say it out loud. Didn't need to. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. I looked back at the sink, at the faint residue still clinging to the stainless steel, and felt something cold settle behind my ribs. They didn't just touch my lake. They didn't just try to shut me down. They made a mistake so big. They were already drinking it. I did not drink it. That was the first rule I set for myself as I stood there, staring at the sink like it had just betrayed me. I grabbed a clean glass from the cabinet, hesitated for half a second, then set it back down untouched. The faint metallic smell still lingered in the air, mixing with the stale scent of last night's coffee grounds. My mind was already moving, mapping things out faster than I could consciously keep up with. Intake point, distribution lines, pressure flow. I walked over to the back door, stepped outside, and the early morning air hit my face with that dry Texas warmth that usually felt grounding. Not today. Today it just made everything sharper. The gravel crunched under my boots as I moved toward the side of the house where the external access panel sat. Old habit. I knelt down, popped it open, and listened. Water moving through pipes has a rhythm to it if you know how to hear it. This one sounded normal. Too normal. Which meant whatever was in there had already passed through whatever filtration system the neighborhood relied on. That was not a good sign. I stood up slowly and looked out past the tree line again. The lake was still hidden from view, but I did not need to see it to know what it looked like. That dull, unnatural sheen. The stillness. The absence of life. My phone buzzed in my pocket, sharp enough to snap me out of the spiral. I pulled it out and saw the name before I even fully registered the vibration. Mark Jensen, my closest neighbor on the south side. Retired firefighter. The kind of guy who noticed things. I answered on the second ring. Ethan, you getting something weird with your water? His voice was tight, not panicked, but close. Turned slightly, pacing now without realizing it. Metallic smell? I asked. There was a pause on the line. Yeah, like a pool, but not right. My wife said it tasted off too. I exhaled slowly through my nose, eyes scanning the horizon like the answer might be written out there somewhere. Do not drink it, I said, keeping my voice steady. Not until we know what we are dealing with. Another pause, longer this time. You think it is coming from the lake? He asked. I did not answer right away, because I already knew the answer. I am going to check something, I said instead. Just hold off using it if you can. I hung up before he could ask anything else. Because once I said it out loud, once I confirmed it, there would be no walking it back. I headed inside, grabbed my laptop from the kitchen table, and pulled up the county infrastructure maps I had saved months ago. Most people never think about where their water comes from. They turn a handle and expect it to be clean. Simple. Invisible. But nothing about water systems is simple. Not if you have seen what happens when they fail. The screen glowed cold in the dim kitchen light as I zoomed in on the grid. Willow Creek Estates. Distribution lines branching out like veins. I followed them backward, tracing the flow upstream, past the residential filters, past the booster pumps, all the way back to the intake source. My jaw tightened before I even reached it. There it was. A small, unassuming label that most people would ignore. Secondary intake reservoir. Coordinates matching exactly with the western edge of my property. My lake. They were pulling from it. Not as a primary source, not officially, but enough to supplement the system during peak demand. Summer months. Early mornings. Times like right now. I leaned back in the chair slowly, the wood creaking under the shift of my weight, and stared at the screen like it might change if I looked long enough. It did not. Of course it did not. The hum of the refrigerator behind me filled the silence, steady and indifferent. I thought back to the last HOA meeting I had bothered to attend. Linda standing at the front, perfectly composed, talking about community, safety, and environmental concerns with that same polished tone. I remembered the way she had glanced at me when she mentioned restricting access to the lake. Not angry, not even annoyed, just certain, like she already knew how it was going to end. My fingers tapped lightly against the table as the pieces started locking into place. The timing, the sudden push to shut down fishing, the overnight change in the water. This was not a random act. It was controlled, measured, and they had assumed no one would connect the dots. that no one would understand how the system actually worked. I stood up again, slower this time, and walked back over to the sink. The faint residue had dried into a barely visible film along the steel. I ran my finger across it, then looked at it under the light. Thin, almost nothing, but enough. Enough to change everything. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, a distant pump kicked on, low and mechanical, sending another surge through the lines. I could feel it in the pipes, in the walls, in the floor beneath my feet. They thought they were solving a problem, cleaning up their version of the neighborhood. What they had actually done was contaminate the one system they depended on to function. I set my hand flat on the counter, grounding myself, and let the realization settle fully this time. This was bigger than me, bigger than the lake. And they had no idea it was already moving through every house on this street, one faucet at a time. I did not call the city. Not yet. That was the instinct most people would have followed. But instinct gets you nowhere when the people on the other end do not understand what they are looking at. I needed proof first. Not guesses. Not suspicions. Something solid enough that no one could explain it away with a shrug and a printed statement. I moved through the house quickly, grabbing what I needed without thinking twice about it. Sampling kit from the garage. Sterile bottles. Labels. Gloves. The familiar weight of the equipment in my hands steadied me more than anything else had that morning. This was work now. Systems. Data. Evidence. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, burning off the thin layer of morning haze, but it did nothing to soften the tension sitting in my chest. The walk down to the lake felt longer than it had 2 days ago. Every step across the dry grass carried that faint crunch, like the ground itself was holding its breath. When I reached the tree line, the smell hit again, sharper this time in the warming air. Chemical, bitter, not overwhelming, but persistent, like it wanted to stay. The water came into view slowly through the branches, and even from a distance I could see the difference. The surface had lost that natural movement, that subtle rhythm that comes from wind and current. Now it just sat there, heavy and dull, reflecting light without depth. I stepped onto the dock carefully, the wood creaking under my weight, and crouched near the edge. Up close, the sheen was undeniable. A thin film, almost invisible unless the angle caught it just right, stretching across the surface like a second skin. I pulled on a pair of gloves, the latex snapping softly against my wrist, and lowered the first bottle into the water. The liquid filled it smoothly, but the clarity was off. Not cloudy, just wrong. I capped it, labeled it, then took another sample a few feet away. Then another. Different depths, different spots. Methodical, controlled. My reflection stared back at me from the surface between each movement, distorted just enough to feel unfamiliar. I worked in silence for several minutes. The only sounds the faint lap of water against the dock and the distant hum of something mechanical carrying across from the subdivision. That sound again. Pumps. Moving water. I straightened up slowly, scanning the far edge of the lake where the intake line sat hidden beneath a small, fenced structure most people never paid attention to. I knew exactly where it was. I had walked that perimeter more times than I could count growing up, back when it was just part of the land, not part of a system feeding hundreds of homes. Now it felt like the center of something much bigger. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me open it anyway. It was a single image. A printed notice, taped to a post near the main entrance of the subdivision. Bold letters across the top. Temporary water advisory. Unusual taste and odor under investigation. I stared at it for a second, then let out a slow breath that felt heavier than it should have. They knew something was wrong. Of course they did. You cannot push contaminated water through a system like this and expect no one to notice. But they did not know why. Not yet. Another message followed immediately after. This one from Mark. People are talking. HOA says it is a treatment issue. Linda is telling everyone to stay calm. I let out a short, humorless laugh under my breath. Of course she was. Control the narrative first. Always. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked out over the lake again. The sunlight caught the surface at a different angle now, making that thin film shimmer just enough to stand out if you knew what to look for. Anyone else would call it algae. Natural. Seasonal. Something you wait out. But I knew better. I had seen this kind of pattern before in case studies, in reports that ended with entire systems being shut down and rebuilt from scratch. Except this time it was not some distant project. It was here. It was mine. And more importantly, it was theirs. I gathered the samples carefully, placing them into the case one by one, each bottle a piece of something that was about to get a lot bigger than any HOA meeting or neighborhood complaint. As I turned back toward the house, that distant hum grew louder for a moment, then faded again, like a pulse moving through the ground itself. The system was still running, still pulling, still distributing. Every minute that passed, more of that water moved through pipes, into kitchens, into bathrooms, into people's daily routines. I reached the edge of the yard and paused, looking back one last time. 2 days ago, this had been a quiet place. Simple. Predictable. Now it felt like the starting point of something that was already in motion. Something that could not be undone with a statement or a meeting. I adjusted my grip on the case, feeling the weight of it settle into my hand, and started walking back up toward the house with a clarity that had not been there before. They had made their move. Quiet. Calculated. They thought they were in control of it. But systems do not lie. And once you understand how they work, you do not need to shout to prove it. You just need to let them run long enough for the truth to surface on its own. I set the samples down on the kitchen counter like they were fragile, even though they were anything but. Each bottle sat in a neat row, clear liquid catching the light in a way that looked harmless to anyone who did not know what they were seeing. But I knew. I could still smell it faintly, even through the sealed caps, that subtle chemical edge that did not belong in any natural body of water. I moved quickly now, rinsing my hands, pulling up my laptop again, and opening the testing protocols I had not needed in years. The screen glow felt colder this time, sharper, like it was cutting straight through the noise in my head. I selected the tests I needed. Heavy metals, organic contaminants, chlorine derivatives, anything that could create that kind of surface film without immediately triggering a shutdown in a basic filtration system. Whoever did this had not just dumped something random into the water. This was measured, controlled, enough to disrupt, not enough to instantly expose. That was the part that bothered me the most. I worked through the first round of field tests in silence, the faint ticking of the wall clock marking time in a way that felt louder than it should have. Each strip dipped, each color change, each reading I recorded pushed the picture into sharper focus. Elevated oxidizing agents. Not extreme but consistent. Traces of something industrial, something you would not find in a private lake unless it was placed there. I leaned back slightly, staring at the numbers written across my notepad, and let out a slow breath. This was not speculation anymore. This was data. My phone buzzed again, louder this time against the counter, vibrating just enough to make one of the sample bottles rattle softly. I picked it up and saw a flood of messages lighting up the screen. Neighborhood group chat. Dozens of them. Complaints about taste. Questions about safety. Photos of cloudy tap water under kitchen lights. Someone had posted a picture of a glass with a faint yellow tint, captioned with a single word. Normal. I scrolled without responding, absorbing the tone more than the words. Confusion. Concern. And underneath it, something else starting to build. Doubt. That was new. That was dangerous for someone like Linda. Another message popped up, this one from her directly, pinned at the top of the thread. Calm, polished, exactly what I expected. We are aware of the temporary change in water quality. Our team is working closely with local services to resolve the issue. Please remain calm and limit unnecessary usage until further notice. I stared at it for a second, then let out a quiet breath through my nose. Limit usage. Not stop. Not shut down. Just limit. That told me everything I needed to know. They had not connected the source yet. They thought it was somewhere in the treatment line, something contained, something they could adjust and move past. They had no idea it was feeding in before any of that even mattered. I set the phone down and walked back over to the sink, turning the handle just enough to let a thin stream run. The sound of water hitting steel echoed softly in the kitchen, steady and controlled, but the smell came back immediately. Faint, persistent. I shut it off again and wiped my hand on a towel, the fabric rough against my skin. This was spreading. Not fast enough to trigger panic, but steady enough to reach every house tied into that system. Every kitchen, every shower, every place people trusted without thinking twice. I glanced back at the samples, then at the clock. Time mattered now, not just for proof but for scale. The longer this ran, the wider it spread. And the wider it spread, the harder it would be for anyone to pretend it was minor. I walked over to the window again, looking out toward the subdivision. From this distance, everything looked normal. Lawns trimmed, cars parked neatly in driveways, sprinklers clicking on in perfect intervals, sending arcs of water across green grass that had no idea what it was being fed. The sound of those sprinklers carried faintly through the air, rhythmic, almost peaceful if you did not know better. I watched one of them for a few seconds, the way the sunlight caught each droplet midair, turning it into something almost beautiful. Then the wind shifted slightly, and that same faint chemical scent drifted back toward me, cutting through the illusion. I stepped back from the window slowly, the pieces aligning in my head with a clarity that felt almost inevitable now. They had tried to control access, control use, control perception, but they had overlooked the one thing they could not isolate: the system itself. You do not poison a source and expect it to stay contained. Not when that source feeds everything. I picked up one of the sample bottles again, holding it up to the light, watching the way it refracted just slightly differently than it should have. Subtle, easy to miss, unless you were looking for it. I set it back down carefully and reached for my phone. Not to call anyone yet, but to start documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, readings. Because when this broke open, and it would not be about opinions or assumptions. It would be about evidence. And right now, I was the only one who understood exactly what they had done. Not just to my lake, but to themselves. I did not sleep that night, not really. The house stayed quiet, but my mind kept running through the same pattern over and over again, tracing the system like a map burned into the back of my eyes. Every intake point, every junction, every place where water slowed just enough to collect what it carried. By morning, the air inside felt stale, like even the walls had absorbed something they should not have. I stepped outside just after sunrise, the sky still pale, and the first thing I noticed was the absence of sound. No birds along the tree line, no movement across the lake, just that same still surface sitting there like it had been frozen in place. I walked the perimeter this time, not the dock, keeping my distance as I moved toward the fenced intake structure on the far side. The ground felt dry under my boots, but there was a faint dampness closer to the edge, like the soil itself was holding on to something new. When I reached the fence, I stopped and crouched, studying the lock, the hinges, the small maintenance panel set low against the metal. Nothing broken, nothing forced. Whoever had done this had not come through here. That meant they did not need to, which narrowed things down more than I liked. I stood up slowly and scanned the tree line behind me, then the neighboring properties beyond it. Clean lines, perfect yards, and somewhere in there, someone had decided this lake was a problem that needed fixing. My phone buzzed again, and this time I did not need to look to know it would be worse. The group chat had doubled overnight. Messages stacked on messages, people talking over each other without answers. Someone mentioned headaches. Someone else said their kids refused to drink the tap water. Another photo popped up, this one showing a coffee maker filled with cloudy liquid that should have been clear. I read through it all without responding, letting the pattern build in my head the same way it had with the test results. Then Linda's name appeared again, another pinned message. We have scheduled an emergency HOA meeting this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Attendance is strongly encouraged. We will address all concerns. I stared at it for a second, then slipped the phone back into my pocket. Of course she would call a meeting, gather everyone, control the room, frame the issue before anyone else could. I started walking back toward the house, the gravel crunching louder now in the growing heat, and felt something settle into place in my chest. This was the moment where most people would step in, raise their hand, try to warn everyone before it got worse. But I did not move faster. I did not call anyone, because if I stepped in now, if I interrupted what was already in motion, they would shift, adjust, contain it just enough to blur the truth. I had seen it before. Systems do not fail all at once. They reveal themselves in stages. And right now, it was still early enough that denial could cover it. By the time I reached the porch, I could hear the distant sound of a car door slamming somewhere down the road, followed by voices carrying faintly through the air. People were already talking in small groups, comparing notes, trying to make sense of something that did not fit their version of normal. I stepped inside and went straight to the counter, checking the samples again, making sure the labels were still clear, the readings still aligned. Everything was where it should be, controlled, documented, real. I picked up my phone again and opened the camera roll, scrolling through the images I had taken. The lake surface, the sheen, the test strips, timestamps on every frame, each one a piece of something that was about to connect whether anyone was ready for it or not. Outside, the sprinkler systems clicked on again, one after another, sending that same treated water back into the ground, into the air, into everything people thought was safe. I stood there for a moment, listening to that steady rhythm, and realized how complete it already was. They had not just touched the lake. They had woven it into every part of their daily routine. Cooking, cleaning, drinking, living. And now, every part of that routine carried the same quiet flaw. I set the phone down and looked toward the clock. 2 o'clock, just a few hours away. Enough time for things to spread a little further. Enough time for doubt to turn into something harder to ignore. I moved to the sink one more time, turning it on just enough to let the water run for a few seconds. The smell was still there, faint but steady. I shut it off and let the silence return, heavier than before. They were going to sit in that meeting room later under bright lights, listening to Linda explain something she did not fully understand. And I would be there too, not to argue, not to warn, just to listen. Because sometimes the fastest way to expose a system is to let it keep running until it proves the truth on its own. I arrived earlier than I needed to, but timing mattered in ways most people never noticed. The HOA clubhouse sat at the center of the subdivision like a quiet stage, clean glass windows reflecting the afternoon sun, the flag out front barely moving in the still air. From a distance, everything looked normal, perfect even, but as I stepped out of my truck, I could already hear the shift in tone. Low voices, short conversations, the kind that stop the second someone new walks into range. The gravel under my boots sounded louder than it should have as I made my way toward the entrance, each step echoing just enough to pull a few glances in my direction. I kept my pace steady, my expression neutral, and pushed the door open into a wave of conditioned air that smelled faintly of coffee and something artificial, like citrus trying too hard to feel clean. Inside, the room was already half full. People stood in small clusters, phones in hand, comparing notes in quiet tones. I caught fragments as I moved past them. Still tastes off. We switched to bottled water. My kids said it smells weird. The same pattern repeating in different voices. Concern, layered with uncertainty. No one had answers yet, just questions. And that was exactly where Linda wanted them. She stood near the front of the room, positioned just to the side of a long table where a stack of printed documents sat perfectly aligned. Her posture was straight, shoulders squared, that same practiced smile resting lightly on her face like it had been placed there deliberately. When she spoke, her voice carried just enough to reach every corner without ever sounding raised. Controlled, measured. I watched her for a moment without approaching, taking in the details. The way she nodded as people spoke to her. The way she placed a hand lightly on someone's arm for emphasis. Reassuring without committing to anything real. It was a performance, and she had been rehearsing it for years. I moved to the side of the room instead of taking a seat, leaning back against the wall where I could see everything without being part of it. My phone stayed in my pocket, silent now, but I could still feel the weight of it against my leg, like a reminder of everything I already knew that no one else in this room did. A few minutes passed, and the volume in the room slowly dropped as more people filtered in. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as they took their places, the low hum of conversation settling into something quieter, more focused. Linda stepped forward then, her heels clicking lightly against the tile, and placed both hands on the edge of the table. The room followed her movement without needing to be told. It always did. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her tone calm, almost warm. "We understand there have been some concerns regarding the water quality over the past day or so." A murmur moved through the crowd, subtle but present. She paused just long enough to let it pass, then continued. "We have been in contact with local services, and at this time, there is no indication of any serious issue. What you are experiencing is most likely a temporary imbalance in the treatment process. These things can happen, especially during seasonal transitions." I watched the faces around the room as she spoke. Some nodded. Some frowned slightly. Most just listened, trying to align what they were hearing with what they had already experienced. It did not quite match, and that gap, that small space between explanation and reality, was starting to widen. Linda reached for one of the printed sheets and lifted it slightly, just enough to show it without handing it out. "As a precaution, we are advising residents to limit non-essential water usage until the system stabilizes. We expect this to resolve quickly. Limit again. Not stop. Not investigate the source. Just adjust behavior and wait." I shifted my weight slightly against the wall, crossing my arms loosely, and let my gaze drift toward the back of the room where a small service door sat partially open. I knew what was behind it. Utility access. Secondary controls. Not the main system, but connected enough to matter. The hum I had been hearing all day seemed louder in here, carried faintly through the structure itself, like the building was quietly echoing what was happening underground. A man near the front raised his hand, his voice tight as he spoke. "If it is just treatment, why does it smell like chemicals?" Linda's smile did not change, but her eyes shifted just slightly, a fraction of a second that most people would miss. "Different treatment agents can produce different temporary odors," she replied smoothly. "It does not indicate anything harmful." The word harmful hung in the air for a second longer than it should have. I could feel the room react to it, even if no one said anything. Because once you introduce that word, you cannot fully take it back. I glanced around again, taking in the subtle shifts. People leaning forward, brows tightening, phones coming back out, ready to record, to document, to compare. The system was doing exactly what systems do under pressure. It was revealing its weak points, and Linda was standing right at the center of it, still trying to hold the shape together. I stayed where I was, silent, watching the room move one step closer to the point where explanation would no longer be enough, knowing that when that moment came, it would not be me who broke it. It would be the truth they were already carrying home in every glass of water they had poured since yesterday. The room did not erupt all at once. It shifted, slowly, like pressure building behind something that had not cracked yet but was getting close. I stayed against the wall, arms still crossed, watching the small details instead of the obvious ones. A woman in the second row twisting the cap of a plastic water bottle over and over without drinking it. A man near the aisle scrolling through his phone, then glancing up at Linda with a look that did not quite match her reassurance. The sound of chairs adjusting, subtle, restless. It was all there if you knew how to read it. Systems do not fail loudly at first. They start with hesitation. Linda continued speaking, her voice steady, her posture unchanged, but the rhythm had shifted just enough that I could hear it. She was repeating herself now, circling the same explanations with slightly different wording, buying time without realizing she was losing it. "We are monitoring the situation closely," she said, hands lightly resting on the table. "There is no need for alarm." That word again. Alarm. People heard it this time. I could see it in the way a few heads turned toward each other, in the way the murmurs did not settle as quickly as before. The gap was widening. A man in the back stood up halfway, not fully committed, then spoke anyway. "If it is not serious, why did the advisory go out?" His Voice carried more than he probably intended. Linda paused, just for a fraction of a second, then smiled again, the same measured expression. Out of an abundance of caution, she replied. We want to ensure everyone is informed while adjustments are being made. Adjustments. That word hung differently, because now people were starting to connect it to what they were experiencing, not what they were being told. I shifted my weight slightly, eyes moving toward the side door again. The faint mechanical hum behind it had grown more noticeable, or maybe the room had just gotten quiet enough for people to hear it. Either way, it was there now, a steady reminder of something still moving, still operating, still pushing water through a system that had not been stopped. A woman near the front raised her hand, her voice softer but sharper in tone. My husband felt sick this morning after drinking it. Is it safe or not? The question landed harder than anything before it. Not technical, not abstract, personal, real. Linda's smile tightened, just barely, but it was enough. There is no confirmed health risk at this time, she said carefully. We are simply advising caution. Confirmed. At this time. Simply. Words layered in a way that sounded safe but felt empty once you pulled them apart. I watched the reactions ripple through the room, subtle but undeniable. People were no longer just listening. They were measuring, comparing, testing what they were hearing against what they had already experienced. That was the moment things started to turn. Not because of anything I said, not because of anything she admitted, but because the system itself was no longer matching the explanation being offered. I reached into my pocket slowly and pulled out my phone, not raising it, not drawing attention, just holding it loosely in my hand. The screen lit up with the images I had taken earlier. The lake surface, the test strips, the timestamps. I did not show them. Not yet, because this was not the moment for proof. This was the moment for realization. Another voice spoke up, this time from somewhere closer to the center. Why does it smell stronger in the mornings? That one hit closer to the truth than they realized. Timing, flow rates, intake cycles, the system pulling harder during peak demand. I could almost see the connection forming in the back of a few minds, incomplete but moving in the right direction. Linda opened her mouth to respond, then paused again, just long enough for the silence to stretch. Water systems can fluctuate based on usage patterns, she said finally. That is normal. Normal. The word did not land this time. It dropped, flat, because nothing about this felt normal anymore. I pushed off the wall slowly, not stepping forward yet, just shifting enough that I was no longer hidden in the background. A few people noticed. Not many, just enough. I did not speak. I did not need to. The room was already doing the work for me. The questions were getting sharper. The answers were getting thinner. And underneath it all, that steady hum continued, quiet but constant, like a heartbeat no one could stop. They had tried to control access, control perception, control the narrative, but they had never controlled the system itself. And now, sitting in this room, surrounded by people who were starting to feel the difference between what they were told and what was real, that system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was delivering the truth, one glass at a time, whether anyone was ready to hear it or not. The room crossed a line without anyone announcing it. You could feel it in the way people stopped waiting for permission to speak, in the way questions started overlapping instead of lining up neatly one at a time. The structure Linda had built for this meeting was still there, but it was slipping piece by piece under the weight of what people were actually experiencing. I took one step forward, then another, not rushing, not forcing attention, just moving into a space where I was no longer part of the background. A few more heads turned this time, enough to shift the focus slightly, like a camera adjusting without anyone touching it. Linda noticed. Of course she did. Her eyes landed on me for just a second, and in that moment, the confidence in her expression flickered. Not gone. Just interrupted. She recovered. Quickly, turning back to the room, lifting one of the printed sheets again as if it still held authority. We are working with professionals to address this, she said, voice still steady, but thinner now, stretched across too many questions. Professionals. I let that word sit for a second, then finally spoke. Which professionals? My voice did not need to be loud. The room was already quiet enough that it carried. Heads turned fully now, attention shifting in a way that felt natural, not forced. Linda's posture tightened just slightly, her hands resting flatter against the table. Local services, she replied, keeping her tone even. They are reviewing the situation. I nodded once, slow, deliberate. Have they tested the intake source? That was the moment. You could see it. Not just in her, but in the room itself. A pause that lasted half a second too long. A question that did not fit the script she had prepared. The treatment facility is handling all necessary evaluations, she said, choosing each word carefully. Treatment facility. Not source. Not intake. I took another step forward, just enough that I was fully visible now, no longer blending into the edges of the room. Because this does not start at the treatment facility, I said, keeping my tone level almost conversational. It starts before that. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Heavier. Focused. People were not just listening now. They were waiting. Linda's smile faded just a fraction, replaced by something more controlled, more defensive. If you have a concern, you can submit it through the proper channels, she said, a little sharper this time. Channels. Process. Delay. I reached into my pocket slowly and pulled out my phone, turning the screen outward without raising it too high. I already did, I said. The first image came up. The lake surface captured in morning light, the thin sheen visible if you knew what to look for. A few people leaned forward instinctively, their eyes narrowing as they tried to understand what they were seeing. I swiped to the next image. Test strips. Readings. Timestamps. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just data. Real and unpolished. Samples taken this morning, I continued, my voice still steady. Multiple points. Consistent results. The room shifted again, but this time it was faster. Quieter conversations broke out immediately, people turning to each other, comparing what they saw on the screen with what they had experienced at home. Linda stepped forward slightly, her heels clicking against the tile, her expression tightening in a way she could no longer fully hide. That does not prove anything about the community water supply, she said, her tone firm, but the edge was there now. I met her gaze directly. It does if you know where your intake is, I replied. Another pause. This one longer, because now the pieces were starting to connect, not just for her, but for everyone in the room. A man near the front spoke before she could respond. Intake from where? His voice carried, sharper than before. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on Linda. Western edge of the property, I said. Secondary intake reservoir. I let that settle for a second, then added the part that mattered. The lake. You could hear it then. Not a single sound, but a collective intake of breath. Subtle but undeniable. People turning fully now, looking at each other, at me, at her, trying to process something that had just shifted from abstract concern to something immediate and real. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it again, the first time since the meeting started that she did not have a ready answer. The hum behind the walls felt louder now, or maybe it was just impossible to ignore anymore. I lowered the phone slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the realization to settle into the room. They had been talking about taste, about smell, about inconvenience. But now they understood the connection. The system was not separate. It was circular, and they were inside it. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue. The truth was already there, moving through pipes, through homes, through every glass they had poured. All I had done was show them where it started. And once you know that, you cannot pretend it ends somewhere else. The silence did not break cleanly. Fractured. Small at first, then faster, voices rising in uneven layers as the realization moved through the room in waves. People were no longer asking what was wrong. They were asking how it could have happened, and more importantly, who let it happen. Chairs scraped louder now as people shifted forward, some standing, others turning fully toward Linda, in a way that stripped away the authority she had been holding on to just minutes before. I stayed where I was, steady, letting the moment build without pushing it. Because once the truth finds its footing, it does not need help walking. Linda tried to recover. I could see it in the way she straightened her shoulders, the way her hands pressed flat against the table again as if she could anchor herself to it. "There is no confirmation that the lake is connected to the issue," she said, but the words came slower now, less certain, like she was hearing them for the first time as she spoke them. Someone near the front shook their head immediately. "You just said it was a treatment problem," he said. "Now you are saying it is not?" Another voice cut in from the side, sharper, louder. "My kids drank that this morning." The room tightened around that statement, not physically but emotionally. You could feel it shift from confusion into something more focused, more urgent. Linda's composure slipped again, just a fraction, but enough. "We are still gathering information," she replied, but even she seemed to realize how thin that sounded now. I took a slow breath, not stepping forward, not taking control, just letting my voice enter the space at the right moment. "The system pulls from the lake during peak demand," I said, calm, measured. "Early morning, high usage cycles." A few people turned toward me again, but this time it was different. Not curiosity, recognition. They had experienced it. The stronger smell, the off taste, the timing. It lined up. A woman near the back spoke, her voice quieter but steady. "So it is already in everything?" I nodded once. "It has been moving through the system since before the advisory went out. No drama, no exaggeration, just fact. That was all it needed to be." The reaction was immediate, but not chaotic, focused. People pulling out phones, calling family members, telling them not to use the water. Others stepping outside, already moving, already acting on something real instead of waiting for permission. Linda stood there in the center of it, still, her control gone in a way she could not recover from with words. Because this was no longer about messaging. It was about consequence. I watched her for a moment, the way her eyes moved across the room, searching for something to hold on to, something to rebuild the narrative around. But there was nothing left to reshape. The system had already spoken. I turned slightly, looking toward the side door again, toward the direction of the intake, the pumps, the lines running beneath everything people thought they understood. The hum was still there, steady, unchanged, but now it sounded different. Not hidden, not distant, just exposed. A few minutes later, the room had thinned out, people moving quickly, conversations shifting from speculation to action. Someone mentioned calling the county. Someone else said they were contacting a testing lab. It was spreading beyond the walls now, just like the water had. I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the air warmer now, carrying that same faint chemical edge if you paid attention. From the parking lot, I could see the tops of the trees that lined the lake, still, unmoving, like they had been all day. Nothing about it looked dramatic from a distance. That was the part most people never understood. Systems do not fail with noise and spectacle. They fail quietly, and then all at once, everything connected to them starts to shift. I walked to my truck slowly, the gravel crunching underfoot, and paused for a second before opening the door. Not to reflect, not to question, just to recognize the moment for what it was. They had tried to control something they did not fully understand. Tried to isolate a problem without realizing they were standing inside it. And in the end, it was not an argument that exposed them. It was the system itself.